Hello, my name is Sergey Barsky, and in this video I will walk through the steps of creating and using entity framework inside ASP.NET vNext application. To follow the demo alone, you will need to download and install Visual Studio 2015. You can do so from visualstudio.com, and because it's still in preview, you can download it for free and use either Enterprise, Professional, or Community Edition, which is free forever. I am using the Enterprise preview for this demo. Let's go ahead and get started. I installed Visual Studio 2015, and this is the start page. And we're going to start by creating a new ASP.NET vNext project. To do that, we click on New Project. We pick ASP.NET Web Application. And we're going to change the name to Demo. And we're going to create the solution. In the next prompt, we have a choice of which template to use. The top templates are ASP.NET 4.6 templates, which are very similar to the previous versions of ASP.NET MVC templates. Instead, we're going to pick one of the preview templates, and we're going to pick Web API. We're going to simply write Web API because the goal of this simple video is to walk through the basics of using Entity Framework 7.0, which has undergone a significant rework, more properly be called rewrite. So let's pick Web API project and walk through the step of creating a project. And it should not take very long. Now we have a solution with a single project, which is a demo. And you see here where it says under references restoring, this is how NuGet works in ASP.NET 5. Now all the references have been restored. We know that there are no yellow icons. And as part of the solution, we really don't have a whole lot of information. We have values controller, which just returns hard-coded values. We have project.json, which is the new projects file that describes the project structure. And we have startup class, which runs when the application first starts up. Let's start by creating our model. Some of the steps are pretty much the same. We're going to create a new class, and we're going to create a very, very simple model. We're going to create person class with just a handful of properties. We're going to add ID and first and last name. Here's person ID, and now let's add a couple more. First name. And one more. And this one is last name. So this portion is done. We're going to remove using statements that are not needed. And now, just like in Entity Framework pre-7 or 6.x, we need to create the context. Before we do that, we have to add some references to Entity Framework, more specifically NuGet packages. There are two ways to do it. You can open project.json as I just did and simply start typing. And we're going to pick Entity Framework, SQL Server, and we're going to pick version 4 and Entity Framework itself. And also we're going to pick version 4. And you can see that NuGet packages are being restored. Alternatively, you can pick Manage NuGet Packages and do the same thing through the UI. I just find that using project.json is a tiny bit faster. Now that we added the reference, we could add our context. We're going to add new class for the context as well. And we're going to call it person context. And it has to inherit, just like in previous version of entity framework, from DB context. And all we have to do is add a using statement for Microsoft.data.entities. Now, just like in the previous version again, we have to add a property. Same type, that type did not change. And we're going to add the DB set, and we're going to call it people. Single property. Now, if you remember, in the previous versions, we have to configure all of our entities. So let's create a table builder in order to configure our only table. And we're going to go through model builder to get a handle on it. And we're going to use the entity, and we know it's a type person. And some of that code probably looks pretty familiar to you. Now it's a little bit different because we're going to use a relational database, and we need to configure the table itself. And we're going to call table function on our table builder, and we're going to give it a name, and we're not going to pluralize in this case, keeping it as person. Now we need to configure the properties. And for a person, it has a number of properties. First, let's configure first name, and we're going to make it required. And then we're going to make it maximum length of maybe 30. And now we're just going to copy that because we don't want to type quite as much. And change the last name. And I'm going to change the lengths. And now if we want to be explicit about the key, which should be recognized based on naming convention, we could also call the key method as well, and the key in our case is the person ID. So when we have one table, it's not really that big of a deal. When we have 100 tables, you can see that on model creating can grow pretty large. In Entity Framework 6, we could create so-called body classes. So for a person, we can create person configuration class that inherits from entity type configuration. That API is sort of missing at this point from the API of Entity Framework 7, but you can quite easily extract this code into a method and then call those methods from the model builder once per class. So you can sort of simulate that code with a little bit of work. So let's build this to make sure it works okay. Hopefully it will. Yep, build successful. Now we need to do a few more things. First of all, we need to specify configuration string somewhere. So we're going to add the configuration file. Entity Framework, and more specifically Visual Studio, comes from a bunch of templates. One of them is for new style of configuration file, and that's the config.json. I'm just going to change the name to be small c, and it actually pre-built something for us specifically for Entity Framework. I'm going to change that to point to SQL Server and change the database name to demo. Let's make sure that I don't have the database name here at this point, and I don't. Now we need some means to verify that the code we're going to write works. Now we need to get back and write a little bit of configuration code. To do that, we need to add some references yet again to project file pointing to configuration classes. They come from Microsoft.framework.configuration model. And we're going to use beta 4 for that. And we also going to need configuration model dot JSON to handle JSON based configuration file. So this should restore momentarily, and now we need to go to startup and pull the configuration over. Haven't seen startup file. It has a few sections. The primary one that we care about is to configure services, and in this case by default it pushes in add MVC framework. We also need to add entity framework, but before we do that we need to provide configuration information. Just in case we need configuration for multiple purposes, we're going to declare a quick property of type iConfiguration. Configuration. We're going to call it configuration get set. And we need to put some namespaces in place. So now we have iConfiguration. Now we need to create it, and we're going to do it in a startup before anything else is alive. So we're going to say config, and we're going to create a new instance of configuration. It is quite simple. We simply create new configuration, which is the base class, and now we're going to call some methods on it. We're going to add JSON file, and the name of JSON file based on what we created is going to be config.json. Whoops, mistyped that, config.json. And now if we wanted to add environmental variables, we can call config add environmental variables. We could also add additional JSON files if we wanted to, including maybe environment specific JSON file. And finally we can say configuration equal config. And that configuration is done. Basically I need to declare this to be public for now. Let's make sure I mistyped it. Mistyped the name, wondering why things don't work. Configuration. Alright, so make sure we can build still. Try one more time. Alright, so that works. Now we can configure entity framework. Entity framework, just like everything else in ASP.NET 5, in order to use entity framework, first of all, we gotta configure entity framework. And entity framework is essentially just another service, just like MVC is. So we're going to add entity framework. Then we're going to add SQL Server, because that's our target database. Finally, we're gonna add DB context to that. And our context is the person context. And now we're going to configure some options through a parameter to use SQL Server. We're going to need a using statement for that. We're going to add using Microsoft.data.entity, which is where some of the configuration methods are. And we're going to say options dot use SQL Server, and here we need to specify connection string, and we're going to use this configuration property we just created, and we need a key, and key is using a dotted syntax, and we're gonna put some colons between the portions of the configuration. And if you think of it of config.json as a tree, and we're gonna need to put segments in here. So we have data segment first, then separated by colon we have default connection segment. Finally, separated by another colon is gonna be connection string segment. And that should configure our entity framework. Now the database obviously does not exist. I'm going to go over preview of migrations in the next video. In this video, we'll simply create database if it does not exist. As you see, there are two key methods here besides startup. There's configure services, and now role there is to add all necessary services to the application. And then we perform any additional configuration on the services that were added, adding them to application or simply doing any other tasks. In our case, we need to get the context and create the database. We're going to do it at the application startup when startup is run. And we're going to call the app, and using dependency injection, we're going to get our service. And the service that we need is using type of person context. This may sound a little bit strange. The DB context itself is the service, but essentially everything is a service. And we're simply gonna cast it for now. Now that we have a context, we can call ctx dot database dot ensure created. And being good citizens, we should wrap all this in a using statement to make sure we properly dispose of our context. This should do the trick once we get all of our parentheses quite right. Here we go. So what we've done so far, we've added entity framework to the list of available services. We told it we were going to use SQL Server and person context attached to SQL Server, and then we just configured the connection string. Now we're ready to write our controller. And one controller was created. We're going to just rename it to person controller, or persons if we want to follow REST conventions. As you can see, attribute-based routing now allows us to use controller naming convention. So our controller is going to be at API and the controller name, which in our case is persons. So our API is going to be under api.persons. And we're going to ignore all this code for a minute. We're just going to delete it for ease of use. And we're going to add some more code for get. This is going to return a list of people. And in our case, let's modify the method. Before we do that, we gotta inject our context. Everything is using dependency injection here. So we're gonna insert person context. We're gonna inject a context in a constructor, and dependency injection engine is going to take care of disposal of the context. One less thing to do. And we're just gonna declare a private variable for now. And we're going to assign a private variable based on what is passed in, which is an instance of our context. Nothing we need to do to dispose of it. Now we just need to return some data. ctx.people, and we're just gonna add some order by in here just for giggles. And we're gonna sort by last name. If we wanted to make it async, we could totally do that, but we'll play with async in the next video or one of the subsequent videos. So let's build it. Make sure everything works. Now it's time to debug it. We're going to debug it using IIS Express. We're going to go ahead and run it. If we wanted to, we could put a breakpoint in the startup on our initialization. So let's put a breakpoint there. Hopefully we didn't hit it quite yet, but we'll see in a minute. Looks like we're okay. New Microsoft browser doesn't seem to like plain requests, so we're gonna wait for address to come up, since I'm not really sure what port this is running on, and copy the address. Hopefully this is the right port number, so let's try that. Hopefully it's on port 2325. Let's see what it's gonna do. Nope, that's not the right port number. So let's shut down Edge for a minute and then restart this and give it another try. And we can go and see that it's on port 3154. So let's change port number here. 3154 API, and we change the name to persons. Persons. Let's try this. See if this is going to behave for us. Let's see if our breakpoint is going to get hit. Alright, the breakpoint went red, which means symbols got loaded. We'll see if it's gonna get hit next. Alright, so breakpoint is hit. Let's see if our context was successfully created. We can actually move our mouse over context. And unfortunately, evaluation timed out, so we're just gonna step over the next line and see if the database gets created. This is a quick and dirty test, obviously does not use migrations, so we're going to continue on. This should hopefully come up with a blank array of people, which it did. So let's refresh list of databases and see if we got a demo database, and we got a table. Scaffolding and other things don't work quite right, so even though we did proper configuration, but the columns did not get scaffolded quite right, and it looks like we're timing out a little bit in SQL Server. Give it a second. Doesn't seem to work, so let's refresh one more time. Demo is the database we used. We're going to edit some rows, and we're just going to add some data. Jane Doe, and we're going to give it a person ID, and then the last name is going to be John, and we're just going to put some random names in just to see if order by is working. There we go. So we've got some data. If everything goes right, we should see those 3 rows return. Hopefully sorted by last name, and we can see start with A, then goes to D, and then goes to L. So it appears like everything is working. So that's our first demo. We'll do a quick recap of what we did. Let's walk through it right quick. So let's find the proper solution here. It is. We're gonna stop the solution from running. What we did so far, we created a basic class, person. We create a context that contains the person using the DB set for the property type. We overrode on model created to configure first the table. And as you can see, we configure table name, that portion works, so the table name is called person. And then we configure a couple of properties. If we take a look to see how properties got created, as columns, you can see there's still nvarchar max. That's because this is beta 4 and entity framework is still work in progress. Not all configuration is being properly scaffolded. Finally, we went over to configuration. We looked at our startup class that's fired when application runs. Then what we did, we pulled the configuration from config.json file. Then we added entity framework service using SQL Server. We added DB context as one of the injectables, and we used the connection string to configure it from our JSON file that was pulled into configuration property right here. Finally, in a configure call, which fires again after we add services, we got an instance of our context as a service, and we called ensure created to make sure database is created. And finally, we ran the demo using IS Express that created database. We browsed some data in that our controller was supposed to return. In our controller, what we do, we treat context as any other injectable service. And we inject it on the constructor of the person controller, assign it to a private variable. Finally, because we call without any parameters, just persons, then MVC finds the best match, which is HTTP GET, since that's what we called, with no parameters, and it returned our people. And that's all there is to it. I will do a walkthrough migrations, basic migrations in the next demo.